Hello, I'm Rebecca the Maths Lady and welcome to this video which is all about teaching children percentages. In this video I'm going to explain how we give children a deep and connected understanding of what percentages are and how we teach them to find percentages of amounts. So if you don't need this video, here's a skip link to your next one which is all about ratio. In order to deeply understand what they're doing with percentages, your children will need to have a secure foundational understanding of finding fractions of amounts. So here's a link to a video which explains that now. They'll need to be confident and fluent in working with numbers to 2 decimal places. So here's a link to that video. And they'll need to be able to multiply and divide by 10 and 100. And I'll put links to all those videos in the description of this video. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to start with a short explanation about number that some people find really useful and some people find a bit tricky. If you find it difficult, don't worry about it too much. You're still going to be able to understand the rest of this video fine. Most people understand percentages without ever thinking about this. But let's talk about the nature of numbers because it does help if you can get your head around this. So when we're doing additions, we have 2 numbers. Let's say 7 add 4. Those numbers are the same. They're both quantities, either numbers of objects or the size of things when they are measured. So that might be 7 centimetres and 4 centimetres. They have to be essentially the same kind of number to be able to add them. But if we were multiplying 7 by 4, because we often see multiplications just written like that, we assume the same thing is going on. But when you add a context to this, you find that one of the numbers has to be a quantity, as it was in addition, either a number of objects or the size of an object when it's measured. But the other number is different. It has to be either a number of groups or a scaling factor, the amount that something is stretched by. And it could be either way round. The 4 could be the quantity, and the 7 could be the scaling or proportioning factor, or the 7 could be the quantity, and the 4 could be the scaling or the proportioning factor. So number can be 2 things. It can be a quantity, or it can be a scaling or proportioning factor. And this idea that number can be 2 things, it can be a quantity or a proportioning or scaling factor, really does underpin the understanding of percentages. So I'm sure at some stage you'll have seen the idea that 23% is the same as 0.23. And you've thought, well, they don't feel quite the same. Well, they are the same size of number. But when we're talking about numbers less than 1 being quantities, so like a length of fabric, 0.23 centimetres of fabric in length, we tend to use 0.23. 0.23 grams of salt, something like that. We'd use the decimal. And we use the percentage when we're doing something different, when we're finding 0.23 as a proportion of an amount. We don't use 23% as a measurement. We wouldn't say we've got 23% of a centimetre length of material. We'd say the price of a car is reduced by 23% or something like that. It's all about proportioning. Now, just to confuse things even more, when we talk about fractions, fractions are useful when we're talking about numbers less than 1 that don't fit perfectly into the decimal system, like 2/3. But fractions we swap between using them as quantities, 2/3 of a centimetre of material, 2/3 of a gram of salt, to using them as proportioning numbers. 2/3 of the sweets, 2/3 of the metal. So we don't have different ways of writing and saying fractions as quantities and fractions as numbers to do with proportion. We just say the fraction, and that's why people get confused. But in percentages, the percentage is the proportion and the decimal number is the quantity, even though they are the same size. I hope that helps a little bit, but if it doesn't, just bear with me and I'll start explaining now about teaching percentages to your class. So when I'm teaching a whole class, I tend to get out my counting stick, label this as 0, this as 1, and then I use my sticky notes to put fractions on the top and decimals on the bottom, and we start making some links between fractions and decimals. If I'm working with a single child or a small group of children, then I wouldn't work with the counting stick. I would work with this decimal number line sheet, which you can download free from all the usual places. And if you want to find more about those worksheets and where to find them, go to authenticmaths.co.uk/worksheets. And I'd do exactly the same exercise, but just on a much smaller scale. And this fits better on the screen, so this is how I'm going to do it today. So we'd start off with 0 and 1, and fractions and decimals. We'd do a little bit of a review, and we'd ask children, if I go here, who can give me the fraction, who can give me the decimal, and we start to link up those two ideas of numbers, and we just play around with those. So that would be 9/10, and it would also be 0.9, and so on. And we'd find as many as we can. And then I'm going to make the link between decimal numbers and percentages, another way of writing number. So again, we're going between 0 and 1. We're having decimals on top and percentages underneath. So 0.5. Does anyone know what that is as a percentage? And we're just trying to pick up there of whether children have already come across percentages at all. Of course, it is 50%. And once we've got 1 anchored on, we talk about the idea of percentages being 100ths. The number of percent is the number of these small parts, which are 100th, that we've gone towards the whole amount. So we could ask children, that mark there, what's that as a percentage? It's 23%, because it's 23 of those. And as a decimal, it's 0.23 because we've moved 2/10 and 3/100ths. And so on. We can play around with this and work on lots of examples. And you might want to come back to this as a starter exercise over all the sessions that you're working on percentages, or certainly the first few. Now, just to build on what I just said, on the top we're working with a number line because decimals are quantities, and on the bottom we're working with a proportion bar because percentages are about proportion. But in terms of numbers, they do link up. And then, of course, the third exercise is to link percentages and fractions. So we've got percentages on the top now and fractions on the bottom, going between 0 and 1. So if I put half on as a fraction, what percentage is 1/2? Well, that's 50% because if necessary, we can count the number of small spaces, so we know for sure. And if I put a quarter on here, what percentage would that be? And we can do that by reasoning. It's half of a half, so therefore it's 25%. But let the children get there in whichever way works for them, that they deeply understand. So you might want to stop, let them think about this, and let them tell you in their own words and come up with a logic to explain what they've done. And at that point in the exercise, I would stop, give them some of these worksheets and ask them to come up with some more links between fractions and decimals, and then get them to tell you what they found, and you can put together the class's results. They might have found that 9/10 is 90%. They might have found that 11/100th is 11%. It's really good for them to listen to what other children have come up with. So that's an introduction to percentages to help children anchor their understanding of the size of percentages in to their understanding of decimals and their understanding of fractions. Now, before we go on to work on percentages of amounts, I would do a little bit of work just with the proportion bar. So we go to mathsbot.com, manipulatives, bar modelling, and then we're going to need to make ourselves a really nice big bar because we're going to split it into 100 parts to show our percentages. So make it as big as you reasonably can. That is fine. And then I always recommend to copy that bar before you split it into 100 parts, because otherwise you have to remove the 100 parts when you copy it. Okay, so now we're going to split our top bar so it becomes a percentage proportion bar. So I'm just repeatedly clicking on the number of parts to get it up to 100 parts. And that's now showing us our percentages. And we could demonstrate that 23%, as I mentioned before, is that much. And we could play around with a few percentages, filling them so that children can clearly begin to have an understanding of the size of different percentages. Next, we want to try and make some links between fractions and percentages, just as we've done. So there we've got a half. What percentage is that? Let the children discuss. Now let's look at thirds. Just moving that up so we can closely compare. It doesn't work very well. That's why thirds are useful to have as fractions, because you can't really do them with percentages. Quarters. Now we can make some more links. And now your children can do that exercise again, where they're trying to find more and more fractions that link with percentages. There, of course, you've got a quarter, you've got 2 quarters, which is a half, and you've got 3 quarters as well. Fifths, and so on. They can play around with that. They can feed back to you some of the links they've made, and then you can put together all the work done by the class. Right, let's get going with finding fractions of amounts. It's best to start to do this organically, letting children find the percentages of an amount that they can confidently find. So if we give them a number like 1200, we could maybe give it a context. We've got 1200 grams of sand. We put that number in the middle of their whiteboard or their blank page, whatever they're working on, and ask them to find some different percentages of that they feel comfortable finding. So hopefully they'll be able to find 50%. 50% is 600. What else might they be able to do? Well, if they've become confident with the idea that you can find 10% by dividing by 10, hopefully they can find that. 10% is 120. Hopefully they can also see that 1% is 12. All this takes a while, and you want to go back to your proportion diagrams to make sure that every child is confident. They might come up with 25% being 300, and so on. Now, some of these lead to other results. So we could put together 50% and 25% to say that 75% is 900. Or a child might have multiplied that by 3 to find that 75% was 900. So they could put on a line, it's going on from this result. It's not actually built from that one too. They could find it up there. And similarly, they could go on from 10% being 120 to find 20%. Or they might have found 20% by finding a fifth. When your children have done some of these, it's a really good idea to get them to check each other's work and try and follow each other's work, because different children find different results. You definitely want to do a few of these. You'll need to do some where 1% is a decimal number. And as you do it, you can check to see if your children are having any problems with any aspects of their calculation. Perhaps they're struggling to divide, perhaps they're struggling to multiply, perhaps they're struggling with their decimals, perhaps they're struggling to multiply and divide by 10 and 100. If they are, you need to zoom in on that and work on it with them. So once they've done several of these, you want to build up the idea that they can find any percentage of an amount. And they could even do that just with these two results, the 10% and the 1%, provided it's a whole number percentage. So 63% would be 6 lots of that and 3 lots of that. So if we look at this video, if we consider finding 23% of an amount again, let's just clearly show that in the percentage bar. Children can now see that finding 2/10 and 3/100 is going to get them the result they need. And we can move on and look at, say, 51%. And then they can see that they could do that by finding 5/10 and 1/100. But there is a shortcut. They could just use half and 1/100. And it is great if they can use those shortcuts. But they need their reliable method of combining tenths and single percentages. And then your final stage of teaching this topic is where you give children individual questions like find 41% of 600, and they're starting to lay out their working. Well, 10% is 60, and they may choose to do 4 lots of that, or they may multiply up. So 40% is 240, and 1% is 6. They understand that they're adding these two numbers, so the answer is going to be 246. And as soon as they're confident working with easy numbers, you want to move on to harder numbers that are going to require them to work with decimals. Your extension work, well, you could get children thinking about fractions of percentages or more than 100% type questions. I tend to try to get them thinking about interest on money and compound interest, and play around with questions like that. If I've got so much money invested in the bank and it increases by 10% each year, how much have I got after 3 years? So your takeaways from this video are that you need to use number lines from 0 to 1 to knit together children's understanding of fractions, decimals and percentages, so they can really deeply link those numbers and make sense of them in terms of the size of the numbers. If you're able to add in the idea of numbers being quantities or proportioning tools, that's great, but don't worry about it too much. It's just good if you've got a bit of a sense of it yourself. And then you need to move on to spider diagrams where children organically find different percentages of amounts in the ways that they feel able to do. And children need to play around with proportion bars or double decimal number lines to link different fractions to different percentages. Then they need to play around with spider diagrams where they put a quantity in the centre and they find different percentages of that quantity in the ways that they feel comfortable and confident with, and you can gradually stretch them to try and find percentages that they haven't found before and to think about shortcuts. And then the final stage is to give them specific questions to find specific percentages of amounts and make sure that they've got a method that always works, like finding 10%, finding 1% and combining however many you need of each of those two amounts. I hope you find this video useful. If you do, if you could subscribe or give us a like, that would be fantastic. And most of all, if you could share it with your friends or colleagues who might also find it useful, that would be wonderful. Thank you for the time that you're investing in becoming a really brilliant teacher who's going to make all the children that you work with super happy and confident and fluent and creative with their maths. If you've got any questions, please post them in the comments here, or any feedback. I would really love to know. You can find a list of all the videos I've created at authenticmaths.co.uk/videos. And I hope to see you again for the next video in this series, which is all about teaching ratio. Have a great day. Bye for now.